This is the final keynote of day one, and if you are here to hear from the brilliant Una Osili, you are in the right place. So thank you so much for your patience, and thanks for some chats over on the right there. I have the pleasure now of introducing Una Osili. Una, welcome. Let me talk a little bit about your wonderful self. I'm so impressed. You serve as the Ephraimson Chair in Philanthropy and Economics and are the Associate Dean for Research and International Programs at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Una also serves as Dean's Fellow for the Mays Family Institute on Diverse Philanthropy. An internationally recognized scholar in economics, Una leads the research and publication of Global Philanthropy Tracker and the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, as well as Giving USA, the annual report on American philanthropy. She is the founder of Generosity for Life, a digital platform. She chairs the school's signature research project, the Philanthropy Panel Study, the most comprehensive study of the generosity of American families over time. She received her bachelor's in economics from Harvard University and her master's and PhD in economics from Northwestern University. She's a sought-after keynote speaker, and we are fortunate to have her with us today to discuss understanding giving trends by race and ethnicity. Her session is informed by research published just last November. Una, without further ado, please take it away.
Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. It's such a pleasure to join you all virtually. Thank you, Emily. And thank you to the entire Transform team, Tammy, Trent. It's been such an honor and a pleasure to be part of this conference and to be able to join you all virtually. I was able to hear the first part of some of the sessions, and I was just excited by all the comments, all the discussion, and all the energy that was coming through. So thank you for putting this conference together, and thank you to all of you who have joined and brought your ideas and all your insights. So today I'm going to share with you some of the latest research on what we know about diverse donors. Now, just take a step back. What we have learned from working on all of this research over the past few years is that donors are diverse. So if you don't remember anything else that I say today, it is really that one size fits all may have worked before, but that doesn't work anymore. As we see our nation changing, demographics are changing, and the nonprofit sector has a real opportunity to meet those donors where they are and to build ladders, pathways, and mechanisms to engage donors of all different backgrounds. So I'd like to just use that as a note of inspiration to help you all start this journey, and I will also share the data. On a very personal note, I know this diversity quite well because my own family comes from all over the world. And so I've seen how diverse donors give, and also that no matter where that individual is from, there are traditions of generosity that are embedded in every community across this country. In this research, what we've also seen is that generosity is baked into it's a norm that cuts across race and ethnicity. And in fact, the point that I frequently make is that before there was even a nation, before there was even the United States of America, there were traditions of generosity in Native American communities, in African American communities, and in so many other corners of our country. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen, and I encourage you throughout this period to jump in, chime in with questions and with any comments that you might have. I hope to not just share information, but also learn from all of you in the process. And today I'm going to take you behind the scenes to see the latest data on how diverse donors are giving and what that means for all of you. Let's go to the next slide, and thank you all for your patience. Today's presentation is based on a multi-year project conducted here at the Lilly Family School that's called Understanding Diverse Donors. And you can download the report on our website. The entire report is available. And what we do is we take you behind the scenes to see how donors of different backgrounds are giving in this fast-changing environment and how you can adapt your practices to actually meet those donors where they are. So on the next slide, I'm going to share just very quickly that we worked with organizations around the country every group is actually represented here. So Native Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, um, Latinx, Hispanic donors, as well as LGBTQ donors and other backgrounds. So this is quite comprehensive. It is both a quantitative as well as qualitative study. So you're going to really get the latest data on how diverse donors are giving. On the very next slide, you might ask, why is this important? Well, in today's world, we have several factors that make this not just a priority for many nonprofits, but also an exciting opportunity. And the way I think about it is there are really two things that are taking place at the same time. Philanthropy is the love of mankind. As I said earlier, it cuts across race and ethnicity in a world that is so polarized. Generosity and philanthropy continue to bring people together of all different backgrounds. And today we have not just that love of mankind, that timeless concept, but also the notion of measurement. We have data, we have tools and techniques, and also even new approaches like artificial intelligence that help us understand what those donors are thinking, what their motivations are, what their priorities are. When you put those two things together, you have a new word, philanthrometrics. And as we think about diverse donors, I want to emphasize once again that generosity cuts across race and ethnicity, and also that today we have the benefit of data so that we can not just assert that this is true, but see what that looks like on the ground. So on the next slide, I'd like to share some of the main questions that I'm sure all of you want to answer, which is, how are those diverse donors giving? What methods, what tools and techniques are they using, and what are their motivations for giving? So going to the next slide, I have the benefit, I should say, or really the blessing of working in philanthropy as a researcher, but also someone who is a donor myself, a board member, and a volunteer. So we had not just the data here, but a lot of the stories to bring alongside that to better understand how diverse donors are giving. And during COVID, we know that the phrase I often use is that business as usual went out the door. So as we think beyond the pandemic, what's next in terms of diverse donor giving, and what's the future of philanthropy as it relates to diverse donors? So let's go to the next slide. As you can imagine, we have all seen a tremendous amount of change in the last few years. A global pandemic that touched every single community in this country and around the world. Also, a racial and social justice movement that raised issues that have long been ignored in many communities around equity and justice, and an ongoing economic crisis. You might think, well, it looks like the threat of a recession is at least not imminent for now, but ongoing economic concerns, including higher inflation, inflationary pressures, but also geopolitical tensions around the world. At the same time, what we've also seen, the good news for everyone that's joined us today, is that there has also been a resurgence of generosity, meaning in communities around this country and even around the world, new opportunities to give. Donors have stepped up. They've also used new platforms to make their donations. So when you put it all together, despite all the challenges that we face locally, nationally, and even globally, there's also a tremendous opportunity because the crisis, the pandemic has exposed a lot of the generosity that previously might have been less visible. Going to the next slide. I just want to remind you just very quickly, many of you know this data, that during the pandemic, giving did reach a new high of $500 billion, exceeded $500 billion. So what I want to also say, because this is the last session of today, we are in a period where, although we hear a lot of bad news and certainly a concerning news every single day, there's also a narrative that we don't hear as much of, which is that there's also an abundance of generosity. And it comes from individuals. Individuals are still the largest slice of American philanthropy. And those individuals are from all different backgrounds. When we look by age and cohort. Our youngest donors, the millennials, the Gen Zs, and even the generations before them, are among the most diverse Americans that have ever been in this country. And when we say diversity, that is, of course, race, ethnicity, but also country of origin, religious background, and motivations and preferences are also diverse. So as we look to the next slide, one of the questions that you might ask is, in addition to all of the everyday donor research, what about high net worth donors and their giving? I think by looking at high net worth donors, we've also seen the real importance of understanding diverse donors. Our latest Bank of America high net worth studies, both the latest waves, have a spotlight on diverse donors. So what we've seen is across populations, whether it's everyday donors, high net worth donors, this is really a time where there is more information, more data about those diverse donors and how to engage and cultivate and build relationships with them. So going to the next slide. The latest Bank of America study does have a wealth of information about race and ethnicity. And as I shared, you can actually dig into that data and learn about different donor segments. So let's go to the very next slide. From our Everyday Donors of Color report, there are key findings that I want to make sure that everyone really takes home and begins to enact in their work. The first is that when we look at the data, we see that donors of color are engaged in a multiplicity of giving practices. That includes giving money, giving time, but also giving testimony, a new term that we have really popularized, and giving of their networks. So what we've increasingly said is that we used to talk about the 3 T's, time, talent, and treasure. But today, the definitions of philanthropy and generosity are expanding. What that means for nonprofits is being able to recognize that donors can, of course, give money, they can give time, but there are other ways they can help support your mission and your cause. And one example of that, very prominent example, is the African American Smithsonian Museum, where they have really found ways to engage donors, volunteers, but also people who want to become members and spread the word around the organization, as well as people who want to donate artifacts and other treasures that they have in their homes. We also found, in addition to the fact that generosity is widespread and cuts across different backgrounds, that the motivations for giving are also quite different for many communities of color. Donors of color may give for different reasons. Over the course of the pandemic, during our interviews with donors, and one benefit, silver lining of the past few years, is that many donors had more time to have conversations and to be reflective about their giving. Many talked about giving to actually help address longstanding issues, whether that's discrimination, barriers that they faced in their careers and or in their lives, and also their faith being a strong motivation for their giving. The third point, and one that I think we need to emphasize because of all the change we're seeing in the philanthropic sector, is that technology is playing a very significant role in how donors of color give. We saw during the pandemic that in order to meet needs, many use different platforms, not just their traditional ways of giving, but new platforms to make those contributions. And finally, as we look at the data and bring together a lot of the interviews that we conducted during the pandemic, many donors of color are increasingly aware of how they can use philanthropy to address current issues, whether those are around racial and social justice. And we saw this especially for African American and Asian American donors. Some of you may have noted that during the past few years, there is a new Asian American Foundation that was actually initiated to help address issues around discrimination facing Asian communities. On the next slide, I'm going to now quickly walk you through each of these key findings. Now that you know the big picture, this is going to be really fun just to go through the data and also share some of the implications. So the first finding is that generosity cuts across. Oh, let's go to the next slide. After the key findings, I think I already talked about the method, so we can go past that. Okay, so the very first finding is that we see generosity across all the groups that we study. Across all races and ethnicities, we have a very diverse group of donors. And I'm very glad someone who's joining us also mentioned that within these broad categories, we have even more diversity, whether it's Asian American, Latinx, Black communities also represent a multitude of types of donors, backgrounds, and different orientations. So the key is, as you think about these groups, this is just a starting point. Within these communities, there's also a lot of diversity. In fact, I'm glad some of the comments are very relevant, because if you want to drill down into specific giving patterns for specific communities, the benefit of this research is that we've also partnered with some of the groups represented here to conduct some deeper dives. And just this past year, 2023, we launched a new report called Understanding Latinx Donors. That actually, so if you're interested in going deeper into any particular group, the report allows you that opportunity. Okay, on the next slide, I hope you can review the information and see the slides. One point that we have stressed, and now here's the data to support that, is that when we look at who's giving, we see high rates of giving for all the groups we study. The way that I have often framed this is that generosity cuts across race and ethnicity. In fact, we see high rates for African American donors, Latinx donors, and once we control for income, wealth, education, these differences that you see on your screen are actually not statistically significant, which means although we hear about disparities in many domains in our society, in our communities, when it comes to giving, we do not have disparities in giving. Americans are givers. Giving is a norm that's deeply embedded in many families and many communities. We also see that women have slightly higher rates of giving. So across gender, there is a strong tradition of women giving, and women actually giving a higher amount even after we account for their income and wealth. So they are essentially punching above their weight, female donors. So this is really an opportunity to highlight the work that's being done here at the school with the Women's Philanthropy Institute around women as donors. Take away from all of this information that we've collected, and this is drawn from the latest Bank of America study, is that generosity is a core value. It cuts across all the different racial and ethnic groups that we study, and all the groups that we study have high giving rates, especially when we look by income, wealth, and education. All right, now going to the next slide. The second finding, and one that I think will be very exciting and hopefully motivating to all of you who've joined, when we look at how diverse donors are giving, they are using a multiplicity of tools. They are using crowdfunding. They are engaging in impact investing. For high net worth donors of color, many of them have vehicles that they've established, whether that is a donor advice fund, a foundation, or a giving circle. And the fact that these practices are really in some ways deeply meaningful to these communities and to these donors is something that's really exciting. One example that really does stand out to me comes out of a giving circle that is housed within the Minneapolis Community Foundation, Asian American donors that have come together. And in the past, their giving circle focused on scholarships for immigrant families. But in 2020, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd right there in Minneapolis, this giving circle decided to focus its efforts on supporting Black leaders, grassroots leaders in Minneapolis. So one benefit of working with diverse donors is really understanding what their motivations are and how they're changing in response to the needs that they see in their communities. So let's go to the data here on the different tools and practices that diverse donors are using. Now, this is going to be too tiny for you to see possibly on the screen, but the takeaway here is when we look across all the different ways that donors can give, we see donors of color using multiple forms. That includes giving through traditional means, but also through non-traditional means, including many of the tech opportunities, crowdfunding, donating goods, donating their services within nonprofits. The message here for those of you who are thinking, how can I use this information, is realizing and recognizing that diverse donors bring a wealth of experience, of knowledge, but also of resources. Those resources may include monetary contributions, but it also may include networks that they can bring, testimony that they can provide, and also the knowledge and practices that they can provide. Moving to the next slide. As we look across the different groups that we study, I also want to emphasize the higher rates of a lot of the, you could say, newer forms of giving that we see among diverse donors in terms of the areas of support, the places that they want to give to, and the types of organizations that they want to support. Moving to the next slide here. Okay, I think we should, since these are quite, they may be more difficult to see, we should probably just go to the next one. All right. And here, I just want to point out, this was a big surprise to many people when we shared this information, that when we look at high net worth donors of color, they have higher rates of using giving vehicles, whether it's a private foundation, a DAF, or even a planned giving instrument. And what I have stressed to many of the folks who work within the nonprofit sector who are working in fundraising is that giving is a priority for many donors of color who have established wealth and who have achieved some level of success. Many of them understand that they faced some barriers and obstacles when they attain their success, and they want to actually reach back and make it easier for others to follow. And so this establishment of a giving vehicle foundation or being part of a giving circle is very important to many of these high net worth donors. Now, moving to the next slide. We're also, a point that I have raised, but I think is worth emphasizing, is that often when people think about diverse donors, they may not be aware that in the United States today, not only is our nation more diverse than ever, but when we look at our younger population, that group is actually probably the most diverse it's ever been. So within that younger cohort, this is the generation that grew up with Instagram, that is on TikTok. Many of them are learning about causes online. They're also giving online, and they're sending opportunities to give to their friends who are also networked. Just to put these numbers in perspective, in 2016, we found that less than 20% of Americans were giving via crowdfunding. Today, just recently in 2020, based on this data, when we add the percentage that are giving via crowdfunding and the percentage that are giving via social media, it's close to 40% of Americans that are giving via technology-fueled platforms. The message here for all of us who are observing and working in the field is that technology is going to be a big piece of engaging a more diverse donor base. Now, as we look at the next slide, I just want to show you some of the numbers here. And this is the percentage that give via crowdfunding and the percentage that give via regular methods. And what you'll just notice from looking at the data is that we have very high rates of giving via technology for a more diverse donor base. So technology is going to be part of your strategy for building relationships with diverse donors. But technology is not the only piece to the puzzle. Certainly what we stress when we look at this is that trust is also important in building relationships with donors of color. And building trust may be more difficult when working with an online population. So this is going to be, of course, not a one size fits all, but understanding that technology can be part of the engagement and also can be part of building those opportunities to actually find those donors and link them to your organization and to your mission. On the next slide, here, what we also want to emphasize is that once again, the role of technology is something that is a broad-based narrative. But as we look at specific ethnic groups, we find very much the case that we even find higher rates of the use of these tech approaches among our more diverse donors and communities. Now, on the next slide, a point that I think may be very interesting also is fast changing is that across our nation, beginning, of course, with 2020, there was an increased awareness of racial and social justice issues. In fact, half of the top 100 cities in America established racial equity funds. These were philanthropic initiatives funded by individual donors, corporate donors, and foundation donors. The Washington Post tracked $50 billion that was committed to racial equity and social justice. And we saw entertainers, sports leaders within sports, but also foundation leaders, civic leaders take very vocal positions and emphasize the role that individuals could play to address these long-standing and perhaps long-neglected issues in their communities. Now, things have, of course, evolved since 2020. Not all of those commitments probably have been fulfilled by the various funders. And you could say that we have a very different environment in 2024 than we did in 2020. However, what we've seen is for many diverse donors, they were already committed to these issues prior to 2020. Many of them have been giving to racial equity. They've been focused on criminal justice and addressing discrimination. And so that hasn't changed. In fact, one thing to take away from the research is that many of these donors, if anything, stepped up their commitment to racial equity and social justice. And in order to build relationships with these donors, it's important to have an understanding of these issues and also show how your organization is making a difference. Now, on the next slide, I'd just like to share some of the data that we've collected during the course of the last few years. First, we did, of course, on our national study, we found that about 20% of Americans overall had made a gift to racial equity and social justice in 2020. When we look at the high net worth population, that number is higher, 25%. And what's also encouraging is that many donors said they would like to learn more about how their giving could be more aligned with these principles. We've done some additional deeper dives to understand what are the motivations, people who say they're giving to racial equity, social justice, what do they hope to accomplish, and why are they making these contributions? So from the qualitative research, we learned that for some donors, this is a personal mission. They want to help those who have perhaps felt the barriers or the disparities in their communities. They want to support those individuals. Some want to support organizations that work on this issue. So whether that's supporting the Urban League, a historically Black college or university or minority serving institution. For others, it's also perhaps giving in a broad-based way. So it may involve giving to a college or university, but allocating those funds in a way that can serve a population that has been historically disadvantaged. The encouraging news from all of this effort is that we've seen a surge in giving to organizations that have been neglected for many decades and maybe even centuries. So one of the most heartwarming, I think those of us who are in philanthropy, heartwarming moments for me during the pandemic was seeing all the generosity that took place. In particular, Mackenzie Scott in 2020, she gave $6 billion alone, and all of those gifts were unrestricted. Some of her larger gifts did go to minority serving institutions, And Howard University received a $40 million gift unrestricted. And just a few, maybe this week, we also heard about Spelman College received a $100 million gift. That's the largest gift on record to a historically Black college and university. For those organizations who may say, well, we're not necessarily working on racial equity or social justice, how do we align with these donors? I think the key is showing what your organization is doing to address these issues, and especially among younger donors. What I have found really interesting, inspiring, is that many of them ask these questions upfront. We've certainly had lots of questions about how is our organization addressing issues around gender equity, around racial equity, around social justice. And the good news for many organizations is you may be working on these issues and not even realize that. And also addressing how are you serving communities that have long been neglected. That may not even be by race and ethnicity. It could be, are you serving populations, communities with disabilities? How are you addressing historically marginalized groups? And younger donors in particular are passionate about these issues. We just completed a qualitative study with a group called Resource Generation, high net worth donors, younger donors who have a real commitment to social justice. And they ask all the organizations they support to share how they're aligning with those values. And so it's important to certainly understand that our younger donors care about this, but also our diverse donors have been giving in this area for a long time. It's also interesting, and along these lines, over the course of the last few years, some donors also wanted to shift their strategy. They want to become more proximate donors. They want, I think this is the phrase that Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative talks about. We need to be more proximate to the communities that we seek to impact. And we did see some donors saying, I'd like to give, but I want to give to organizations that are on the ground, closer to the issues, addressing these issues in real time. And so on that note, we also saw giving to grassroots organizations, small organizations that historically did not receive large gifts. I think that's really encouraging. And going back to Mackenzie Scott, one of her themes in all her gifts is really to find those organizations that are making the most impact. And what we found is that some of those are groups working on gender equity, on racial equity, or groups that historically have done great work, but haven't necessarily received all the attention. So if you're one of those organizations that's working within a community and haven't necessarily received a lot of large gifts, this may be your moment. In fact, an organization we profile in the Everyday Donors of Color project is a group called Collectively in Baltimore. They're a grassroots organization. They fund small grassroots Black-led and community-led organizations. And during COVID, they had a lot of donors who came to them who said, I want to help within communities. I may not have the connectivity that you do. And this allowed them to serve as an intermediary, a resource for those donors who wanted to reach directly communities that were affected by many of these issues. On the next slide, this is the fun part. So let's talk about what all of this means. We've spent the last few years, we've had a global pandemic, a racial and social justice movement, and we've also had ongoing economic uncertainty and anxiety. But there has been one consistent theme in our work throughout this period, and it's a theme that has both inspired me and all of our research team here at the Lilly Family School. And that is that generosity cuts across ethnicity and it cuts across race. We see giving in every single community that we study. We also see that this is an opportunity for nonprofits that have not historically engaged with diverse donors. This is a moment where you can start with the data, understand who is in your community, and understand that you have an opportunity to build relationships and engage with donors of all different backgrounds. In addition to that, as we drill deeper into the data, we've also learned that notions of giving are much broader as we look at diverse donors. It is not just about writing a check. it's about a deeper engagement. Sometimes that's about volunteering. The concept of mutual aid, people helping people, something we saw during the pandemic. And many organizations have actually partnered with communities and grassroots organizations to leverage those mutual aid networks. One example right here in our own home city of Indianapolis comes from a lot of the environmental organizations that realized they could partner with neighborhood groups who are already doing this work to reach their goals. In the wake of the pandemic, we've also seen that donors of color are very much interested in giving to racial and social justice causes, regardless of the political tenor in the country or in the specific state or community that you live in. There is that commitment, and that has been maintained. And then finally, as you think about how do you engage donors of color, of course, we have the traditional methods that have been tried and tested over time, but we also have a wealth of new tools. For me, during the pandemic, it was an eye-opener when I realized that our young daughter, a teenager, was giving via TikTok. TikTok had a donation sticker where you could, as you created your videos, you could give. So as these new forms become much more evident and visible, it's also, I think, an opportunity as well as a way to reach these diverse donors to make sure that we're using all the mechanisms and all the tools and techniques that are available. Now, as we go to discuss more of the implications on the next slide, the first question I get, and I'm sure this group will have this question, is how do you actually do this? We know that we have a more diverse country. We know that our young donors are our most diverse cohort to date. How do we actually do this work of building a more diverse donor base? I think the first thing is to really start with the data and start somewhere. You don't have to have this all figured out, but you do have to think about how can we start to build a more diverse donor base, not just for now, but for the future. I often say start with the data, start now, be intentional about how you're going to build those relationships so that they are based on trust and they're authentic. For some organizations, it's also looking inward to your board and to your staff and volunteer base. Do you have a diverse board? Do you have a diverse staff? And do you also have a diverse stakeholder group that you can engage as you seek to build a diverse donor base? And then finally, I think there you can see the slide has many steps, but I think the final point is that this is actually a process that will enrich your organization. One of the groups that we've worked with over the last few years is a senior serving group in New York City that has a very diverse group of donors, staff members, and board members. And they often talk about this as being key to their mission. I worked within higher education. We also have a very diverse student population, and our donor base doesn't always reflect that. So one thing that we have to think about is how can our donor base reflect all of the communities that we serve? How can we tap into the generosity that is already embedded in many of the communities that we work with? And also, how can we infuse our own practices with many of the themes and talents and treasures that exist within diverse communities? As we go to the next slide, I also want to emphasize that reaching diverse donors is also going to involve expanding our data tools and techniques. Starting with our definition of philanthropy, most organizations, of course, monetary contributions are key. However, it may involve starting with how do we engage not just the 3 T's, but all the channels, whether that's the talents that those organizations have, the treasures that they have, the testimony and the networks, the ties that they have. And keep in mind that as I shared about the Smithsonian, that has proved to be such an inspiring model of generosity, because not only is it one of the most supported of the Smithsonian's, but in terms of visits, in terms of shares and likes on social media, They have raised a new level of support, stakeholder engagement, and experiences with their donors. In addition to that, we also talk about the role of trust. With in addition to all the data that we collect here at the Lilly Family School, one measure that I have been following very closely is the lower levels of trust that Americans have in institutions across the board, and especially for our youngest Americans. Trust is at an all-time low, meaning most Americans don't trust the institutions they support, whether those are state and local government, the judiciary, you name it, big business. What has stood out over time is that nonprofits remain the most trusted of all of our institutions. So as we think about building trust with communities of color, it's also important to communicate in the ways that donors certainly understand and appreciate, and building authentic relationships with donors. Finally, understanding that reaching and building relationships with donors of color will involve using new vehicles. It may not just be the traditional vehicles that will engage those donors, but also newer vehicles, whether that's impact investing, crowdfunding. One example that has really resonated in this environment is our community foundation here in Indianapolis. The Central Indiana Community Foundation has set up an impact investing opportunity. And we've seen that that has attracted a lot of younger donors and many diverse donors who want to set up those impact accounts, because not only do they gives them an opportunity to make a difference in the community, but those impact accounts can be recyclable funds and essentially be used to support initiatives that benefit the community down the road. As I think about what all of this means in this era of transformation and change, on the next slide, I'd like to just highlight that all of this information that I've just shared is available on the website, on our school's website, in addition to the report that I've shared today, Understanding Trends with Diverse Donors During this Era of Transformation. We have a new report that was also launched that looks at trends over time in diverse donor giving. And as I mentioned, a complementary study that's a deeper dive into the Latinx community. One of the comments that I saw as I was presenting was that these are umbrella terms and they encompass so many different giving traditions and experiences. And so what I also want to encourage is that as you think about this research, as you spend some time with the data, understand that one size fits all doesn't work anymore. It may not never have worked, but it certainly doesn't work in this environment. And that fundraisers, nonprofit leaders, donors, and those working in nonprofits need to essentially in this era understand that they can serve those donors of all different backgrounds. They can build relationships with them, and that those relationships can yield dividends beyond measure. So it's been exciting to see what's taking place in the field, not just that donors of all different backgrounds are giving, but that nonprofit organizations are also innovating in their approaches so that they can build these meaningful partnerships. So I will stop here and open it up for questions. I think Emily is going to help moderate, but of activity in the chat.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Una. As my camera takes a second here to turn on, just would really like to thank you for all of the wisdom and insight that you've shared with us. And again, way to roll with any tech glitches and bumps. So you certainly left me feeling optimistic, and the reality that one size just doesn't fit all, and relationships are at the core. So you're really great at looking at that chat while you're speaking. So thank you for keeping up. But I have let everyone know if they have something specific to feel free to put it there or go to the Q&A box. See if we have anything specific. There were a few questions that were coming in. Just I think some things were resolved as you spoke. People clarifying resources. Tammy, thank you for sharing some links. So let me go ahead and hit this Q&A section.
I see one comment that is actually excellent, and I'm so glad this point was brought up because I feel like it bears repeating. So for a long time, donors of color have been treated as beneficiaries, recipients of philanthropy, and not givers. And one reason we have these reports is to change that narrative, to help people understand that communities of color are not just beneficiaries or recipients, but they're givers. And I shared a lot of inspiring stories about what's taking place around the country. But I think there was one interview we had with a donor that left me very disappointed and discouraged. And I just want to share that because it sort of shows where we can also do better as a field. And this was a donor that had set up an account at a community foundation. And each time she attended events for donors, donor events at the community foundation, people asked her what organization she was representing. Was she there to raise funds? Was she there to be a presenter? And she said, no, I have a fund here at this community foundation. And she said, after doing that a few times and getting that same response, she realized that this wasn't what she wanted as a donor. She wanted to be recognized for the giving that she had done, and also recognize that she was here also to learn and to be enriched by the nonprofit presenters. She wasn't a presenter herself, but that led her to then join a giving circle with other Asian American donors. I think the point that the person who just sent in her chat is that we have to be part of shifting that narrative that donors come in all different backgrounds, that giving is part of our American identity. In these divided times that we live in, this is something that unites us. That's what is so exciting. But the nonprofit sector also needs to, I'd say, kind of advance its thinking and really see that as our communities, of course, across all dimensions become more diverse, we also have to make sure that we are recognizing our donors and recognizing the values that they bring and the rich experiences and motivations that they bring to the table.
Well, thank you for reading that comment and giving your insight on that. You also mentioned not only donors coming in different shapes, sizes, ethnicities. You mentioned some TikTok donations, right? Using different platforms to accept donations. So again, your data is invaluable, and you are getting a lot of great love about being so insightful. And thank you for being so generous with your data and insights here. By the way, we don't just accept questions. We do accept any other aha moments, any other takeaways. This audience has been in for the long haul, a lot of stamina to make it to the end of the day. And wow, it was certainly worth it. But again, we are just nearing the end of day one. So I do want to give everyone another chance to leave us a question or comment. And Una, is there anything that you would like to share? Any sort of last, again, your presentation was just packed with content, but any other last thoughts?
Well, I will encourage all of you who are interested in these topics, in digging into the data and learning more, to join us here at the Lilly Family School. We have the Mays Family Institute on Diverse Donors. We have a speaker series that features different donors. And in fact, during the past year or two, we've had everyone from Mark Morial at the Urban League to Lin-Manuel Miranda's father. And in fact, he was, if you can go back and watch that, but one of the points he makes is that when you talk about giving, that in fact, his experience is that communities of color actually, if you were to total up everything they're giving, they may even be giving more, controlling for their income and wealth than individuals of different backgrounds. He talked about it's not even called giving in his own experience. It's called sharing. People share what they have, whether that's their resources, their time, their networks, connections. So very important as we think about how do we take all of this information and put it into practice. It's really recognizing that donors of color are part of our communities. Many nonprofits have this, I'd say, opportunity really to make sure that they're engaging donors and building those engagement opportunities. It's not a one size fits all. You've heard me say that many times. But then there's also joy in learning from those donors, their motivations, why they give, what they care about. And that can reinvigorate your work as you learn from the donors about why these issues matter to them.
Wow. Well, Thank you for, again, closing it so strongly with that insight. We're so lucky to have had you today. Thank you for, like I said, any other questions, thoughts, and everything coming through the chat. So lots of love for you, Una. So
All right.
appreciate you.
I feel the love. I'm so excited and look forward to continuing to engage with this fantastic audience. Thank you all. Bye-bye.